Lucero. Rating 83. Cover me, I'm going in. Javi holstered his submachine gun. He sprinted faster with his hands was free. Fire back, bub, the sniper rode toward him. Her voice echoed in Javi's headset. Try not to make this another suicide run. Ha ha, Javi uttered humorously. Cover me, West subpar banker. Armored feet clanged against the naked metal of the ship's hull. Javi powered toward the glowing orb at the center of the ship. My banker is anything but subpar, the sniper said. Javi would have chastised her for distracting him from this definitely not a suicide run, but Rogue Rogue not expertly taken out the two sentries lurching for him. The clawed tips of their gauntlets would have taken precious seconds to shake off, seconds between getting half if they were going to make it out of that base alive. Good shot, baby! Nice, Javi said. A good leader praised his team when they deserved it. Now keep it up. This is where things are going to get tricky. Javi grabbed the orb, its purple light chasing shadows on the ridges of his plate armor. He tucked it under one arm and bolted, ducking and rolling to the side before a third sentry could sink its talons into him. Payload en route. Javi said, grateful not to shout into his mic. He had a bad habit of doing that, carnage to carnage his squad. Sometimes the excitement was hard to deny, especially when they were all playing their parts, moving together like a well-oiled machine. Clocks are ticking, Bubs, the medic, Domino, one. He hung back while Javi and the others did their thing. Yeah, I know, dude. Javi nodded on his lower lip as he pressed on. Was the part that had tripped him up the past 3 times they attempted this mission. He had to time his jump just right, a millisecond too early or a millisecond too late, and the entire team would wipe. And he didn't have time to stand and wait for the platforms to line perfectly. The orb was a ticking bomb. If he held it too long, it would explode. Then jumping on 5 consecutive moving platforms would be the least of Javi's worries. I hate this level, Domino muttered. Have I mentioned how much I hate this level? Yes, multiple times, Rogue replied, and we're all super sick of hearing me saying it. Javi's guild, the Marvelous Cosmic Assassin for Team MCA for short, was the first in the world to make it to this level of the cooperative play mode in Polaris, the world's largest space-haunted alien shooting MMO game. But unless they completed it soon, they wouldn't be the first to finish. And that, Javi knew, was unacceptable for his team and more importantly for his sponsors. Nobody got endorsement deals for coming in second place. Victory paid the bills. Victory put food on the table, tuition checks in the mail, and fresh school uniforms on his siblings. Victory slapped a coat of polish on his rating, keeping it high enough to rake in the big bucks. Come on, Javi whispered to no one. His team usually ignored him when he started talking to himself with the mic on. It was one of Rupp's intricacies, part of his charm. Come on. It was all in his thumbs. Javi flew over the buttons, angling the thumbstick and lightly tapping on the X at just the right time. He played the controller like Stan Bliss played his trusty Bonneville Bosendivers piano. He was almost there, and at the necklace of energy in which he had to deposit the orb. One more we danced. Oh, come on! And a millisecond too late. He watched his spoon plummet into an ignorance and in, in, ignominious and melt to a bloody pulp by the ship's engine. Told you it was a suicide gun, the sniper's voice jubilating with equal parts disappointment and smug satisfaction. Like like she, she liked being proved right almost as much as she liked winning. Javi let the controller slip from his hand. His palm had gone clammy on the approach. It made his thumb slip at precisely the wrong moment. He wiped his brow, mopping away the sweat that had begun to threadbare. The room was sweltering. The attic of their old home was improperly insulated. It boiled in summer and froze in the winter, but it was quiet. Javi needed solitude to be gained. He had a tendency to get a little too intense when he was 6 hours into a campaign. Even his little sister, Eva, said he looked staring. But Eva didn't know what it was like. That it was that intensity that put food on their table and his sneakers on her feet. Better luck next time, Pups, came the medic's decidedly less smug voice. Domino took every loss to heart. Yeah, sorry guys. Javi rubbed his eyes. They'd gone dry staring at the glowing monitor. I'll try soloing this part later to practice. You've got the keys for the checkpoints so I can try again tonight. Rogue chuckled, and the sound timing in Javi's ear. No way you can solo this, Pups. Maybe you can't. Javi flexed his hands, cracking his knuckles and stretching his fingers. His carpal tunnel would act up later if he didn't go through his wrist exercises before bed. Gaming took a physical toll, even if it was an almost entirely stationary activity. His hands were his money makers. Without them he was nothing, and without him his family would lose their house. It may have had shoddy insulation, cramped bedrooms, and a rickety boiler, but it was still home. The rest of the team recapped the day's work with varying degrees of grumbling. Cooperative play was low on their list of preferred activities. They excelled at PvP combat, but co-op was the game's hot ticket item at the moment. The developers had offered a special sponsorship package to the first team to complete all of Polaris' punishing stages, 7 unique levels communalating at the hardest boss battle at any of them had yet to encounter. He extended his arms in front of him to stretch his wrists. The app listened to the guild chatter as he gently pulled back on the fingers on one hand and then the other. Javi's mind wandered to that morning. He used to love the first day of school, but now classes represented little more than hours spent not gaming. But today had proved enough amusement for his resentment. Like the cute boy with the camera in his dark wavy hair and his equally dark eyes and the freckles that dusted the bridge of his nose. And the graffiti. Hey guys, Javi formed fists with both hands and angled them down, pointed in his stretch across the top side of his wrist. He felt nice. Have you ever heard about the weird graffiti recently? Something about the ratings? Nope, none. Night? No. Why? Rogue asked. Javi shrugged before remembering they couldn't see him do it. Just something strange at school. I noticed it wasn't popping up on mine and wanted to ask. It was curious that there had been little mention of the graffiti on the doors of Malapacope Academy on social media. A few posts had popped up that morning and it was in its immediate wake. But by lunchtime they'd been just thoroughly scrubbed, not leaving not so much a digital footprint. Javi felt a part of his brain picked up, the part that liked to devote itself to wildly unfounded theories about aliens building the pyramids of Giza or constructing the Nazca lines in Peru. He loved a good conspiracy theory, and the graffiti felt like it had the makings of one. Rogue hummed in his ear. Can't say I've noticed anything, but I'll keep my eyes peeled. Thanks, Rogue. You always do it. You always do. Then he flexed his fingers and shook out his hands. That would have to do for now. Alright, I'm out. See you guys later. He didn't wait for their muffled goodbyes. He slid his headset off. His ears ached in relief. They weren't a perfect fit, but they'd come as a part of his latest sponsorship package, along with the customized lumbar support and gaming mouse. Each time was emblazoned with the Panthera logo, a leaping jungle cat, claws barred in its mouth, open in the silent roar. Panthera was the leading manufacturer of gaming prohibitors and Javi's primary sponsor. Or at least they would be, so long he and his team stayed on top of their game, and so long as Javi's rating hovered in the 80s, a rare feat for a 17-year-old orphan. His grandmother would slap him across the back of his skull if she had heard him revert to himself as such. He might have lost his parents 7.5 years ago, but his grandma had always been the one to raise him even before their parents had died in a car crash. Their tires skidding off an icy road at the dead of night. He desperately wished he could forget. Javi! His grandmother's voice rang with the renaissance of a church bell from the floors below. Come down for dinner before your brothers and sisters eat it all. But it was not an empty threat. Abdul, I'm coming! Javi shouted loud enough for even her failing hearing to catch. Javi pushed away from his desk, delighting in the satisfying pops and cracks sounding from his joints as he stood and stretched. His back ached and his left leg had lost feeling below the knee, but the discomfort was a sign of a job well done, even if he had worked his gigantor gauntlet. But tomorrow was, as they say, a new day. The Lucero children were already crowded around the table by the time Javi made it down to the dining room. He squeezed into his seat between Eva, a 12-year-old, and the twins, Donna and Dora, short for 10-year-olds. How was school? Abdullah asked as she piled heaping servings of arroz con grandules onto their plate. Oh, you know, fine. That's all you ever say. Fine, grumbled his grandmother. She waved one hand in disdain as the other removed the bowl of rice from Eva's clutches. Everything is always just fine. Considering the tuition at that fancy school, they should be expanding your vocabulary, not shrinking it. The truth was, Javi paid very little attention to school. At the fact, he kept it to himself. It wasn't very difficult, posting in the top 5% of his class, 15% of his class. His grades were good enough to be moderately distinguished without being spectacular enough to draw his attention away from more lucrative pursuits. Javier rarely studied. He didn't have to. Our memory, a child psychologist had told his parents when they brought him to evaluations at the age of 8 was merely photographic. His mind was a vault. When something was there, it was in there forever. Most lectures he listened only with one ear. He had a true gift for multitasking, an ability that contributed to what he seriously and deservingly called his gaming prowess. My friend Sandria said someone spray-painted bad words on the side of the building, Eva announced. Queef? Abdullah stretched that single syllable to 3 times its natural length. Vandals? At that school? It wasn't a big deal, Javi said, even though it was very much a big deal. A big deal that curiously had made it to the news, local or otherwise. People and events critical of the ratings system really did. It was probably some dumb start of the year prank. I don't want you getting involved with any of those people causing trouble, Debbie. You're a good boy and you better stay that way. I'm not involved. But all his protest earned him was a pointed stare. He added, yes, Abdullah. So he added, yes, Abdullah. A squawk from one of the twins was enough to change the subject. Doro had stolen Damia's pork chop, where he had stolen his. The details didn't matter. They did this every night. It was comforting in its familiarity. Javi let the sound of their squabbling wash over him as his mind wandered. What occupied his thoughts wasn't the high drama of the vandalism or the simmering tension that had rasped student bodies and darred day in its wake, but one student in particular. A boy with a camera, standing off to the side, watching a world that didn't seem particularly interested in watching him. Javi had been told he had a nice smile, a powerful smile, and it wasn't just his grandmother who said so. He was the smile that had launched 1,000 Panthera headsets, and that was in its pre-orders alone. He had smiled at Noah, and Noah had stumbled over his words, and the sound of it had sent it a reason of pleasure through Javi's body. It wasn't one thing to know his smile was appreciated by thousands of people. He would never meet. But it was one whole other thing entirely to know that he was appreciated by only one person in particular. That morning on the lawn wasn't the first time Jemmy had noticed Noah. He'd been noticing him since freshman year. The boy was quiet more often than not, kept to himself. He was usually the last to be picked for team sports in phys ed. He was so easy to miss. Noah had a tendency to fade into the background. It was almost an art form. He faded with as much virtuosity as Javi shined. It was his silence that appealed to Javi, his solitude. Noah was good-looking in a frustratingly effortless way, but that appreciation had come later. Javi surrounded himself with friends and fans with his build. He was never alone. Not at home, not at school, not even in the game. He didn't know what to do with himself during instances of unexpected isolation. He didn't help but admire the way Noah took to it as if it was his natural state, but being alone seemed so hard, so alien. But Noah never looked lonely, and that, Javi thought, required a strength of character that he didn't think he possessed. Javi always appeared confident, even especially when he wasn't. He wrapped his confidence around himself the way Noah did his solitude. It was familiar, well worn. It was, in a way, armor. He wanted to ask Noah how he did it, how he managed to move through the world without allowing it to touch him. But the words never left his lips. Talking came easy to Javi. Most of the time it was like performing. From reading his siblings' stories to bedtime to entertaining the followers of his pitch stream while he played. He became comfortable with more demanding, comfortable with speaking, but speaking to Noah felt as if it would be different, more demanding somehow. Noah didn't waste words, and Javi rarely to think about his own. He wasn't sure how to go about navigating a person like that. But he wasn't much wanted to find out. You're obsessing, he told himself. Acknowledging it didn't seem to help. He finished his dinner and shrugged upstairs. Maybe Polaris would distract him. As soon as he booted up the game, a small red badge appeared up on the upper right corner of the message icon. In-game mail was notoriously unwieldy. It was poorly maintained. Messages had a habit of disappearing from one inbox of their own rotation. The anonymity of the game encouraged all sorts of failure of humanely prompts and on social media platforms. But every now and then a fan reached out to Javi to express their delight at encountering him in-game, and those were always nice messages to receive. Javi clicked the message icon, drumming his fingers on the desk as he waited for his overtaxed broadband to connect. He needed to update again to ensure his connection remained stable and strong while gaming. but upgrades often cost money and tuition was due for him and his siblings. His fingers filled as the message loaded. It wasn't text but an image, a gesture, exactly like the stickers affixed to the security cameras at the front entrance of Malapa Academy. Behind the gesture's painted face, 4 lines of text stood out, written in the same words read as the gesture's makeup. On the day of the prophet false, one last dance of forbidden waltz, a copper found and fortune told, all beside a box of gold. With the fish sticks, Javi said softly. The Abdullah would whip him upside the head with his chancellor if she caught him praying under her roof. He grabbed the nearest scrap of paper he could find amid the disorganized clutter on his desk. There was a poster featuring Javi wearing every Panther headset he just moved, the very Panther headset he just moved, with the mustache drawn on his face in Sharpie, courtesy of one of his siblings. They thought his endorsement details were hilarious, with the same Sharpie that probably they'd used to deface his own image. Javi scribbled down the message before the game's relatable inbox had a chance to devour it whole. He stamped the picture snapped the picture with his phone too, just in case. He leaned back in his chair, puffing out heavy breath. It was a troll. He'd been trolled by someone with too much time on their hands, and since he had too much time on his hands, he'd fallen right into their trap. The urge to reply to the initial message was too powerful to ignore. He always told his girl not to feed the trolls, but it was too late. It was late, and he was tired, and his eyes were straining from staring at the rolling screen too long, and making sound decisions for chumps. He wiggled his fingers over the keyboard, puzzling over how to respond. Then the Polaris client flashed. Javi blinked on the screen. That was weird. He clicked the icon to boot the game up again. It took longer than usual. Also, when he got back to his inbox, he found it. The message was gone. The gesture had vanished. Troll, he whispered up at the glow-in-the-dark stars in his ceiling. He stuck them up there when he was 9 and never got around to removing them. Just troll. But no matter how many times he silently repeated the words as he got ready for bed, he couldn't shake the sight of the jester uncanny, knowing smile. Bex Johnson, reading 91. At Malapa Academy, pupils lack for nothing. The school boasted state-of-the-art laboratories, fully equipped, athletic faculties, and libraries large enough to satisfy the needs of most curious scholars. But it wasn't simply enriching the minds of Malapathrop offered prospective students. The school's ethos promised a range of benefits for attendees. A celestial education, yes, but also a promising future. A healthy boost to the ratings of its graduates, and most importantly, wellness. The wellness quota was served by offering the entirety of the student body a free period in the middle of the day, during which no classes were scheduled. It was officially called the rest period and unofficially called siesta, but few actually rested during it. True, some distressed students might grab quick naps on any soft, quiet spot they could find, but Bex Johnson was not one of those students. Not a day went by without at least one scheduled activity taking place during her rest period. Monday, flute lessons in the new music hall. Tuesday, planning meeting for the Lantern, Lapithorpe's student-run newspaper, of which Bex was the editor-in-chief. She held this role since her sophomore year, an unpredicted move for an underclassman, but she refused to settle for any lesser position. Monday, athletes practice. Thursday, speech and debate team. Friday, linguistics club. Bex was merely cheerier of the club. In fact, that made her mother frown whenever she remembered that there were two officers, president and vice president, raised above her daughter's post. After Lapithorpe was stricken of a vandal armed with a can of blood-red spray paint, Bex spent her Tuesday siesta calling to order the year's first meeting of the Lantern. All anyone could talk about was the graffiti. It had been wiped from the doors, but not from the minds of the Lapithorpe students. Talk of it was quite quickly shushed by the teacher in classroom and hallways, but there was no way to truly silence several hundred teenagers who had just witnessed the juiciest bit of gossip to hit the academy since Elizabeth Reynolds, student council vice president, had a nervous breakdown 2 years ago and attempted to blow up her smartwatch in the chem lab using highly combustible potassium chloride solution. Melody bumped Bex's shoulder as they sat two desks they pushed together to bend their heads over Bex's tablet. Melody's position at the Lantern wasn't exactly editorial in nature. She wrote the weekly hit horoscopes, but she attended meetings with Bex when her schedule allowed. "Looks good, Bex," said Melody. Bex put the finishing touches on the mock-up of Friday's front page. There was only one event that was newsworthy enough for a full front-page splash, and everyone knew it. Bex stared at the blank space over the article she'd written on to the stolen snatches of time between class. "We need a photo." "Oh!" Melody slapped her hand against desk, jolting Bex's carefully arrayed set of colored pins off the surface. Bex frowned at her as she bent down to pick them up. But like all her frowns, it had a minimal effect on Melody. "I forgot to tell you, I saw that kid taking photos of the graffiti. The one with the hipster camera. I told him to come in today to let us take a look at one of his pictures. Thought we could use one." "Good thinking." Bex once again lined up her pens in a neat row, sorted by hue. "Which kid?" "The weird one, with the floppy hair and the long blank stare and the beginning antisocial tendencies, benign antisocial tendencies, as if summoned by the incomplete but," Bex noted, "not wholly inaccurate description. A student Bex had never encountered before appeared in the doorway. His hair was indeed floppy, and he did hunch his shoulders slightly, as if engaging in even this minor social interaction caused him physical pain. But his stare wasn't blank so much as guarded." "Hey!" Melody hopped out of her seat and twirled her arms extended. "Welcome to the illustrations office of the Lantern." She gestured to Bex with a grand sweep of her arms, and "this is our benevolent dictator, Bex Johnson." "Hey," the boy said, hoisting the camera strap higher on his shoulder. The device was distinctly vintage. "I'm Noah." "Hi, Noah. Melody, you said you wanted photos of the graffiti?" "Yeah," Bex said. "If you have some higher res ones, that would be great." He swung his backpack off and pulled a thick folder from it. "I developed some last night. Actually, I couldn't wait." Noah grew slightly more animated as he spoke about the work, flipping through each photograph as Melody and Bex admired them. They were good, very good. Bex pointed to one that caught her eye. The framing was perfect. Students milled about the vandalized doors. Their faces all pointed to the scene of the crime. A teacher stood off to the side, hands on her hips, brow pinched in concentration. "Do you mind if we use this one?" "Yeah, no, I don't mind," Noah said. It might be kind of cool, actually. Never really show these to anyone." "Never?" Melody asked. "That's a crime. You have talent." "And I almost never admit it when anyone else does." Amara's smile worked its way into Noah's face. It softened the sharpness of his bone structure, making him look even younger. "Thanks." Before Melody could flirt with him farther, the door opened. Bex turned to see Mr. Doahue, the Lantern's faculty advisor, enter the room. Normally his hands were full of professional newspapers from across the country, like he liked to share with his students as examples of the type of journalism they should aim for. But today his hands were empty and his expression tight. "Ah, Rebecca, you're here already. Good," Mr. Donahue said. "Oh, and we even have a new face. Always nice to see." He didn't sit down at the large desk at the front of the room as like normal. He stood, hands hanging awkwardly at his side. "Is something wrong, Mr. Donahue?" Bex asked. No. Well, yes, I suppose. Nothing truly terrible, I promise." Then Melody prodded. "What is it?" "Here's the thing," Donahue said. Bex steadied herself. A thing, when delivered in that tone of voice, was rarely nothing truly terrible. Donahue looked like he was about to reveal their rating that had dipped by 5 points each. "The school's administration has decided to suspend publication of the Lantern for the time being." Melody jerked back as if struck. Ever the dramatist. "What?" "Mind you, the hiatus won't affect the titles you include on your college resumes. The Lantern will be lit once more, don't you worry." He smiled at his own turn of phrase. "Why?" Bex asked. She hadn't displayed the immediate knee-jerk reaction Melody did. It simply wasn't in her nature. But something cold and hard had formed in her gut at the news, and it worked its way up her throat and out her mouth in the stoniest single word inquiry she had ever uttered. "Well, you see, it's due to the rather unfortunate incident that happened this week. Certain extracurricular activities will be suspended until the school can conclude its formal investigation into the crime." "It wasn't technically a crime," Bex posed, "but it had seemed like relatively harmless one. Just a senior having a bit of ill-advised fun." There was at least one every year. But that isn't fair, Bex said. Donahue blinked at her, surprised. She had never talked back to a teacher before, not once, in her years of grueling education. I understand you work very hard here, Rebecca, said Mr. Donahue, but this isn't about you. The word stung. She was she wasn't being selfish. She wasn't. She simply didn't understand why they were being penalized for a crime they hadn't committed. Donahue was already inching towards the door, his reluctance to answer any more of Bex's questions written in the stats lines of his posture. I will be sure to let you know when the suspension has been lifted. Until then, consider yourselves free to rest. The cheer in Donahue's voice was so obviously forced. Bex had to suppress the urge to roll her eyes at him. Eye-rolling a teacher was a quick way to take a small hit to one's rating. It is rest period after all. With that, he was gone, leaving Bex, Melody, and Noah to stare at the door slowly swinging shut behind them. Well, that was amazingly weird. Melody did always have a penchant for stating the obvious. They didn't want us talking about it, Bex said. It was the conspicuous subtext of Donahue's conspurious subtext of Donahue's announcement. Marapathurk wanted to make sure it was controlled. It controlled the narrative surrounding the unprecedented act of vandalism. Perhaps they wanted to erase it altogether. But why? Noah asked. That, Bex, is the question. Noah Rayner, rated 64. Noah had always been a healthy child. He was small for his age and prone to injury because of an innate WBS. He had never seemed to able to shake, but otherwise healthy. The only time he'd ever been admitted to a hospital was when he had fallen out of a tree at the age of 12 and broken his leg. He'd climbed it too high from a group of kids who used to call him Nerdy Noah because the kids were clever like that. Unfortunately for Noah, they decided that his small stature and thick framed glass which he'd since replaced with contacts, made him the perfect punching bag. Fortunately for Noah, they hadn't bothered to look up as they passed under the tree's branches, hunting for their prey. Finding no one to torment, they settled under the tree, backs against front, and played an immeasurably long game on their phones. From what Noah could hear from 15 feet above their heads, it was some kind of multiplayer fighting game, and none of them were particularly good at it. Eventually, the kids grew bored and left. By that point, Noah had been in the tree for 2 hours, and his muscles were stiff and unresponsive. Shimmying down the tree, provided a significantly greater challenge than climbing up. One wrong step, and he plummeted to the ground, taking his fall with the tibia of his left leg. His phone smashed on impact, rendering it useless. So he lay on the ground for 15 excruciating minutes until his little sister, Cilicia, found him. Sissy was only 7 at the time. He was supposed to have been watching her as she covered in the nearby playground, but he failed in his most fundamental duty as a brother. Sissy had, on the other hand, provided herself a better sibling. Not only had she summoned a passing adult to call her mother, but she hadn't even tattled about Noah's negligence. Ever since then, they'd been rid or dead. Despite the 5-year gap in their ages, Noah often felt that Sissy was his best friend. He took her to the movies, even if the animated fare she preferred made Noah want to drown himself in the jumbo popcorn they always ordered. He saved up his allowance so they could eat like kings, and at the Pick and Mix candy station at the mall, they'd even created their own shared language, a sloppy combination of pig wagonin and rudimentary Spanish Noah learned in middle school. When she'd held his hand at the hospital when he cried as they were applying the cast to his broken leg. Noah had worn the cast for weeks. The most popular he'd been in school was that Monday after the fall. All the girls in class wanted to sign his cast. One of the boys, most of the same group who had driven him up the tree to begin with, gifted Noah a cruelly drawn example of the male economy. One of the girls in his class, Melody or Melina. Noah was as terrible with names as he was good at faces, had thoroughly covered it up with a large rainbow unicorn. But despite a relative healthy youth, Noah was far more familiar with hospitals than most people his age. His little sister hadn't shared Noah's genetic fortune. Cece had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia at the age of 8, and spent her childhood in and out of hospitals. These days were mostly in. She was 13 when he first asked his parents if he could give Cece his own bone marrow. They'd shared a look that seemed to say a great deal of things, but all they told Noah was that one had to be 18 in order to donate. And so he waited until the day after his 18th birthday. He went to the hospital without his parents, who were both at work, to discuss donations with Cece's primary oncologist, Dr. Ronald Liu. Dr. Liu offered Noah a file and a consent form for the blood test to see if Noah was a match. He sat in the stiff back chair in Noah's office, and the buzzing in his ears overpowering the sound of Dr. Liu's calm, steady voice. It had a good voice for a doctor who worked with terminally ill children. It was smooth and deep, and Noah was sure people found it reassuring. In that moment, he didn't feel assured. He was unmoored. Noah? Dr. Liu's brow furrowed in what looked like concern, but his brow was almost always furrowed, so it was hard to tell. Are you listening to me? Noah lied. Yes, Noah lied. Well, it wasn't entirely a lie. He had been listening at the start of the conversation, only he'd stopped a few sentences, and he wasn't a match. Cece needed a donor, and Noah was not a match. Dr. Liu folded his hands over the papers on his desk. the one that had declared Noah unfit to be Cece's donor. I know this must be hard to hear, and I commend you for trying, but it was always a long shot. Noah blinked. A long shot? No, Dr. Lou nodded. It was a good stage nod that went with his deep, soothing voice. Noah wondered if the doctor practiced these incredibly soothing expressions in the mirror before he left for the hospital in the morning, or perhaps the repeated work of delivering the worst possible news to families with 6 children was practice enough. Matches are more likely to found within families for the most part. 6 siblings are usually most likely to match. 1 in 4, Noah said. His voice sounded distant, as if it was echoing all around in his skull after someone else had spoken. Excuse me? There's a 1 in 4 chance of siblings having a bone marrow match, Noah said, though why he was explaining to an oncologist of all things seemed the Hey, you stop saying it to me! I looked it up, I did up all the research. 1 in 4 has a good chance, but it left a 75% chance that Noah wouldn't be a match. Still, he felt certain. Dr. Love nodded again, even more slowly this time. For biological siblings, yes. The buzzing in Noah's ears swelled to a feverish concerto. Biological siblings. But I'm a brother, Noah said, though the truth was already poking holes in the shield of Noah's certainties. Biological. The word felt damning. Dr. Lowe's hand folded again, unfolded once more. He pressed his palms into the front of the papers on his desk. Noah, have your parents discussed your adopt? Noah didn't finish this question. He didn't have to. I apologize. I assumed you knew. I'm her brother. Noah was speaking only to himself now. Dr. Lou, repeating it wouldn't change a thing, but his mind was clinging desperately to the lie he'd believed his entire life. You are her brother, Dr. Lou said softly, intensely. Cecilia is your sister, and she loves you very much. Nothing will change that. Noah blinked again. He must have looked so slow and stupid and dumbstruck. Blood doesn't make a family, Dr. Lou said, and then, sensing perhaps that he had wildly overstepped his bounds, he added, You should speak to your parents, Noah. Noah nodded. It was not a good stag nod like the doctor. It was a shallow and too quick, and it made him feel slightly nauseated. Noah's hands tightened on the stiffened needle in his lap. It was bright green and looked like a cross between a chinchilla and a cat. He picked it up on the way to the hospital after spotting it in the shop window. It was an alien comparison from some game Cece liked, cute in a weird extraterrestrial sort of way. Cece lived or stuff like that. He'd brought it with him to Dr. Lou's office, hoping that he would be able to visit Cece afterward to convey the good news. But he didn't have any good news. He hadn't told her he was testing his bone marrow. He hadn't even told her his parents, but maybe if he had, this whole conversation with Dr. Lou would be avoided. Maybe they would have told him themselves, or maybe they had never planned on doing so. Maybe they'd intended for Noah to live his life without a vital piece of information about his own biology. His biology wasn't their biology. His blood wasn't not their blood. Blood doesn't make a family, and it didn't. Noah knew that family was about a lot more than the womb in which one had been carried, but the information sat in his stomach like a hard and indigestible lump. It remained hard and indigestible the entire bus ride home, and the dumb green space Chichiba thing was still in his hand. He'd gone to see Sissa, but he wasn't sure how to face her. If he'd be able to school his expression into something normal and comforting for her sake. She never wanted to be treated like she was sick, and Noah mostly excelled at that. But he didn't trust his own shifting emotions. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even particularly sad, beyond the sadness that had come with knowing he could help Cece. He wasn't sure that he was feeling what he was feeling, but he was sure that he was feeling a great deal of it. His parents were still at work by the time he arrived home. Noah didn't bother going upstairs to his bedroom to change out of his blazer and slacks, despite the fact it was one of the greatest pleasures in his life.
Hello? The fabric of the blazer itched, and the sacks made him feel like the dweeb he probably was. He didn't even stop to grab a snack from the kitchen like as he did every day after school, despite the fact that he skipped lunch in favor of snapping candids for of the students of Malapathrope Academy around around campus. He was afraid that if he put anything in his stomach, he would rebel against the great unnameable feeling and be expelled from his body immediately. Noah made straight for the dark room he and his dad had built in the basement 2 summers ago. Cece had been admitted for another lengthy stay at Magnolia Children's Hospital, and having an activity to occupy them had benefited both Noah and his father. His father, who isn't his father except for all the ways in which he was, the dark room felt more personal to Noah than his own bedroom. The walls of Noah's room were decorated with posters of bands he'd long ago stopped following. His bed was still covered in dinosaur sheets because Cece liked them, and he was loath to remove anything that gave even the smallest amount of joy. The dark room was his. In a way, nothing else in the world was. No one was allowed to enter, not since the time his mother had thrown on the lights and ruined the photos he had been developing of Cece's birthday. Her face that had been smeared with rainbow frosting from the funfetti cake Noah had baked for her. They'd eaten it by the handful because doing so was disgusting and made Cece laugh so hard she snorted. But those pictures had been destroyed, inspiring the strict entry policy for Noah's darkroom. The Rayner family respected this, and when he was in there, no one bothered him. Today, Noah didn't want to be bothered. He needed to be alone. Solitude made processing information easier, and he had a lot of processing to do. The red light of the darkroom soothed the ragged edges of Noah's thoughts. Hours passed as he sat on the floor, backpack tossed to one side carelessly, his camera placed on the ground beside him with much more care. He hadn't realized how long he'd been sitting there until a knock sounded on the door. "Noah, you in there, Noah?" It was his father, the man who raised him and whose blood he didn't share. "Yeah," the word came from Noah in a croak, his voice shaky and disgusted. "Well, dinner's ready. Your mom made lasagna." His mom had reheated lasagna. She'd made a big batch on Sundays, and they lived on it until the large glass disk was empty. "I'm not hungry." His father was silent on the other side of the door for the span of a few breaths, which Noah dutifully counted. Then even eventually, "Suit yourself." Noah listened to his father's footstep as he climbed the stairs. The hard, indigestible lump in his guts grew within every retreating footfall. Talisman Moore. Rating 32. Standing at her locker between periods, Talisman grimaced as the device on her wrist buzzed again. It was the 5th time that day, and while she often took pleasure in flouting the rules of Malapathrope and society as a whole, she was certain that she hadn't earned 5 separate rating reductions yet. Or maybe she pissed someone off at this bus ride to school, or her chem teacher was feeling less generous than usual about her slight tardiness. She actually enjoyed her science classes, so she went to most of those. Mrs. Stevens, more lenient than the rest of the faculty, especially with her central favorites. Maybe Malapathrope teachers hadn't been instructed to bring down the hammer in light of the vandalism. "Mrs. Moore, may I have a word with you?" The voice came in the other side of Talisman's open locker door. She couldn't see the face of the speaker, but she didn't need to. The voice belonged to the man who delivered the news that morning assembly every day in the authoritative tones. And even though Talisman's attendance at such assemblies was sporadic at best, she still knew the stern disapproval of that voice like she knew the back of her own hand. She didn't think she'd ever heard anything but stern disapproval from it. Coming to think of it, with the slow, deliberate speed of a death row inmate walking to her execution, Tamsin closed the door and turned to face Master Wood. He was tall, far taller than any a school administrator had any right to be, and Tamsin had to look up to meet his gaze. She hated looking up at people. She was far more comfortable looking down at them. On them. "Sure, Dr. Wood, I don't have anything important on the old agenda." Wood pursed his lips in distinctly unamused fashion. "As a matter of fact, you have chemistry this period." Tamsin offered him his best artful shrug. "Wasn't like I was planning on going anyway." "Ah, there's that blatant disregard for authority I've come to know and love," Miss Wood said. "Come with me." He turned and used his unreasonably long legs to stride down the hallway, not even looking back to see if she was following. For a few seconds, Tamsin considered not following him, just despite the unwavering confidence Wood had in his own authority, but she didn't. For starters, she had the feeling that was exactly what he was expecting of her, and so he so hated to be predictable. And there was the minor fact of her rating system was a sham, a disgrace, an era bit arbitrary algorithm designed to maintain the status quo of privilege and prestige. But the thought of flouting it to the point where she was expelled gave her pause. Not that she cared about the consequences for her own life, but her mother ran a tiny apothecary in a green, gentle to survive part of town, catering to far wealthier people. They barely scraped by as it was, despite her bravado. Talisman Hampson Hampson didn't truly want to hurt the one person in her life whose opinion actually mattered. Her mother wanted her to graduate. Maybe she should try. Tamsin trudged after Wood, the heels of her heavy blocked boots dragging on the polished wooden floors. The halls had quieted, with most students sitting dutifully in class where Talisman was supposed to be. Not insignificant part A not insignificant part of Talisman was curious about Wood requesting her presence during a class period. He could have intercepted her after school, provided she didn't cut, which would have honestly been a bit of a gamble. During her designated lunch period, he'd waited until most of the student body and staff were preoccupied. Interesting. And so she followed him all the way to his office. The room was set in one of the towers overlooking the main quad on campus. It reminded Tamsin of the diagrams of old prisons she'd seen in textbooks in the library's recycling pile. The school sent outdated or otherwise undesirable books to be turned into mulch and made into new books, but Tamsin enjoyed a spot of literally dumpster diving the way she suspected other girls like shopping for prom dresses. From the bank of the large windows set in the curving walls of the room, Wood had a view of practically the entire campus. It wasn't her first time in the office. That was how she knew the abandoned music building was just out of his line of sight. It made her business dealings safe from his prying eyes. Tamsin Moore, rating 32. Standing at her locker between periods, Tamsin grimaced as the device on her wrist buzzed. Again. It was the fifth time that day, and while she often took pleasure in flouting the rules of Malapathrope and society as a whole, she was certain that she hadn't earned 5 separate rating reductions yet. Maybe she'd pissed someone off at the bus ride to school. Or her chem teacher was feeling less generous than usual about her slight tardiness. She actually enjoyed her science classes, so she went to most of those. Miss Steffens was normally more lenient than the rest of the faculty, especially with her senatorial favorites. Maybe Malapathrope teachers had been instructed to bring down the hammer in light of the vandalism. Miss Moore, may I have a word with you? The voice came from the other side of Tamsin's open locker door. She couldn't see that face of the speaker, but she didn't need to. The voice belonged to the man who delivered the news at morning assembly every day in authoritative tones. Even though Tamsin's attendance at such assemblies was sporadic at best, she still knew the stern disapproval of that voice like she knew the back of her own hand. She didn't think she'd ever heard anything but stern disapproval from it, come to think of it. With the slow, deliberate speed of a death row inmate walking to her execution, Tamsin closed the door and turned to face Headmaster Wood. He was tall, far taller than a school administrator had any right to be, and Tamsin had to look up to meet his gaze. Tamsin hated looking up at people. She was far more comfortable looking down on them. "Sure, Dr. Wood. I don't have anything important on the old agenda." Wood pursed his lips in distinctly unamused fashion. "As a matter of fact, you have chemistry this period." Tamsin offered him her best artful shrug. Like I wasn't like I was planning on going anyway. "Ah, there's the blatant disregard for authority I've come to know and love," Wood said. "Come with me." He turned and used his unreasonably long legs to stride down the hallway, not even looking back to see if she was following. For a few seconds Tamsin considered not following him, just despite the unwavering confidence Wood had in his own authority. But she didn't. For starters, she had a feeling that was She had a feeling that that was exactly what he was expecting of her, and she hated to be predictable. And there was the minor fact of her rating. The system was a sham, a disgrace, an arbitrary algorithm designed to maintain the status quo of privilege and prestige. But the thought of flouting it to the point where she was expelled gave her pause. Not that she cared about the consequences for her own life, but her mother ran a tiny apothecary in the Jennifered part of town. Gentierford part of town, catering to far wealthier people. They barely scraped by as it was, despite her bravado. Tamsin didn't truly want to hurt the one person in her life whose opinion actually mattered. Her mother wanted her to graduate. Maybe she should try. Tamsin trudged after Wood, the heels of her heavy block boots dragging on the polished wooden floors. The halls had quieted, most students sitting dutifully in class, where Tamsin was supposed to be. Not insignificant part of Tamsin was curious about Wood requesting her presence during a class period. He could have intercepted her after school, provided she didn't cut, which would have honestly been a bit of a gamble. Or during her designated lunch period. He'd waited until most of the student body and staff were preoccupied. Interesting. And so she followed him all the way to his office. The room was set in one of the towers overlooking the main quad on campus. It reminded Tamsin of the diagrams of old prisons she'd seen in a textbook in the library's recycling pile. The school sent outdated or otherwise undesirable books to be turned into mulch and made into new books. But Tamsin enjoyed a spot of library dumpster diving the way she suspected other girls liked shopping for prom dresses. From the bank of large windows set into the curving walls of the room, Wood had a view of practically the entire campus. It wasn't her first time in the office. That was how she knew the abandoned music building was just out of his line of sight. It made her business dealings safe from his prying eyes. "Take a seat, Tamsin." Wood gestured to one of the leather chairs before his desk. They were far less grand than the one he lowered himself into. An obvious power move, Tamsin thought, reminding one's opponent of their place, making them feel smaller. The joke was on him. Tamsin was so accustomed to the disdain directed at her from her fellow Malapathrope students that she hardly felt Wood's intimidation tactic. "I wouldn't beat around the bush." Wood set his elbows on his desk, resting his chin against his loosely collapsed hands. She wondered if he'd seen the pose in a manual designed to teach school officials how to look relaxed and casual while still projecting an air of foreboding. "We need to talk about your rating." Tamsin held up her wrist, beaming with something a lot like pride. "Yeah, it's abysmal, right?" Wood managed to look even less amused. "It is. You're on the cusp of expulsion." Tamsin nodded. None of this was news. She was only surprised it had taken Wood this long to say what they had both knew out loud. I don't want to expel you, Tamsin." She rolled her eyes, exaggerating the move to make sure he knew she really meant it. "Right. Let me guess. You think I could be a valuable asset to Malapathrope community. You see a great potential in me to be a productive member of society. Yada yada. I heard this spiral before." Wood cocked his head to the side as if studying the dog that had just learned how to ride a bike. "Hardly." Tamsin blinked at him. "Pardon?" "I didn't think you'll ever be a valuable asset to the Malapathrope community, Tamsin. Nor do I think you have much interest in productivity to society as a whole." This wasn't how she'd been expecting the conversation to go. "So, why did you call me into your office if you're not going to try to convince me to get my act together?" She motioned between them, hoping her loose hand gestures succinctly conveyed the disparity of their positions, life philosophies, and regard for the rule of law and order. "What's the point of this?" "Here's the thing. I don't want you to get your act together, to please me or your teachers or anyone else." Isn't that how society operates?" He ignored her, plowing toward his point. "I want you to get your act together for yourself. You're smart. Smart enough to skirt the rules without falling so far a fool of them that you lose your place here. Smart enough to get decent enough grades to pass while putting in the absolute minimal effort. Smart enough to spearhead your own flourishing underground business." So he knew about her tartar card hustle. Interesting. Tamsin thought that he didn't put a stop to it. "I see potential in you, and I do believe that you're capable of great things. But one thing I don't want you to see you nurture is your own stupidity." Tamsin had been accustomed of a lot of things by her various teachers throughout the years. Stupidity had never been one of them. "Excuse me?" Whatever you want to do in this life, you won't be able to do if you shoot yourself in the foot before you even get into the door. Maybe I don't want to get my foot in the door. Maybe I want to stay outside in the light and light the whole house on fire. She wished she had the lighter she used for her candles in the music building. Flicking it right then would have been the greatest self-indulgent drama. With a swift twitch of his fingers, Wood tapped something on the face of his own smartwatch. Half a second later, her own blood buzzed against her skin. She glanced down at the screen, not surprised to see it flash an even more abysmal 31 back at her. Here at Malapathrope, we have a zero-tolerance policy for arson. You'll remember that in the future. But I wasn't... Tamsin swallowed her protest. It was a power move, like the disparate seating arrangement and the Orwellian view of the campus behind them. George Orwell, the author of another book she found in the library's mulch pile. In 1984, she tried to find any of his other works in circulation, but her search of the library's system catalog hadn't returned a single title. Your position here is a precarious one. I want to make sure you understand it. Tamsin bit down on the tender flesh on the inside of her cheek before giving her answer through clenched teeth. Trust me, I do. Wood straightened up, relinquishing the pretense of being relaxed and approachable. Good. See that you remember it. When I read the names of this year's seniors at graduation in the spring, I expect to see your name on it. Not for my sake, but for yours. He reached for a stack of papers in a crumb tray on his desk before flicking his gaze to her. That'll be all, Miss Moore. I've already told Miss Stevens you'll be late for class, so you don't need to worry about a rating deduction for being tardy today. I hope that you take the time to think about what I've said. Tamsin grumbled out an extremely insincere thank you and goodbye, and trudged out of his office with double the speed she'd entered. The halls were empty as she made her way back to her locker. The thick soles of her boots thudded dully against the wooden floors with no other sound to cushion the fall. She could go to class. She probably wouldn't. Maybe she would. Maybe sitting through the drudgery of a lecture would be worth not subjugating herself to another one of Wood's. He wasn't wrong about her. Not really. She was smart. She was probably the smartest person she knew. Not only had she managed to disable a number of fire exits in school to enable her numerous escapes, but she figured out how to confuse the motion sensors installed in the derelict music building. Simply turning them off triggered an alarm in the faculty's office, but redirecting them to a passive garage near the back. Now, that took skill. But Tamsin didn't know what she wanted to do with all that genius. She knew what she didn't want to do. That was easy. She didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a hedge fund manager or whatever career Malapathrope's best and brightest were funneled into after graduating from college. And while she admired her mother's work ethic and her ability to keep a small business afloat in a place like Jackson Hills, she wasn't sure the life of a humble shopkeeper was for her either. So far, the only vocations in life that gave her pleasure were hoodwinking the rich and gullible and inspiring a vague sense of unease in everyone around her. Tamsin's boots skidded to a stop when she reached her locker. There was a card taped to it. She approached cautiously. It wasn't the first time someone had messed with her locker. There had been an unfortunate incident her freshman year when a group of girls she'd always suspected Summer Rollins had been involved scribbled down a slew of unkind messages on it. The nicest of them was a simple freak. But this wasn't the vengeful scrawl of a mean-spirited 14-year-old. This was a single Tartar card. The nondescript script, not blue and white pattern on the back, was marred by a sticker of a smiling jester. Tamsin plucked it off the door and turned it over, expecting to see something uninspired, like death or any of the more violent-looking sword cards. Maybe an angry client was seeking revenge for a negative reading, but the face of the card presented none of those. She blinked at it, puzzled. The Hanged Man. It wasn't a bad card, despite the connotations of the name. It could be interpreted to mean letting go of negative patterns or of behavior or shedding bad habits holding you back. It could also symbolize surrender, sacrifice, martyrdom. There was a number of ways to read the card, just as there were a number of ways to read almost any card, especially those in the major arcana. But there was something about the card that felt sinister to Tamsin. She looked at it more closely. What had initially looked like a design on the white border of the card was actually text. Each letter had been surgically cut from what Tamsin could only assume was a book with a vintage typesetting and precisely glued to the card. On the day of this prophet false, one mustn't dance in a forbidden waltz. A copper found and fortune told, all beside a box of gold. She looked at her right, then her left. The corridors were as empty as they'd been when she'd left Wood's office. Whoever had left the card had likely done so in the sliver of time between their bell ringing and her arrival. She didn't imagine someone would have done it with an audience of dozens of students milling about the halls. Tamsin slipped the card into her pocket and made it for the stairwell nearest her locker. She made sure the door didn't slam behind her. The hinges were temporal at the one. The old music building waited for her, and hopefully there she would be able to solve the riddle of the Hanged Man and the jester. Her feet had barely touched the grass outside the fire exit when a voice broke her stride. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Moore?" Tamsin bit back a groan. She pivoted in place. Leaning against the wall was the physical education teacher, Miss Lynch. Her cropped red hair fluttered in the gentle early autumn breeze. She flicked the ash off her cigarette as she regarded Tamsin with an ambiguous expression. "As a matter of fact, I thought I could use some fresh air," Tamsin said. "It gets really stuffy in there." Lynch barked out a laugh, as if she hadn't been a phys ed teacher. Tamsin probably would have liked her. She always seemed different from the other faculty members at Malapathrope. Not more relaxed. Her personality skewed a little too close to drill sergeant for Tamsin's liking, but less conservative, perhaps. "You're telling me." Tamsin took a slow drag of her cigarette. It was rare to see a teacher smoking at Malapathrope. Tamsin wondered if Headmaster Wood would dock Lynch's rating for it if he caught her. You supposed to be in class?" Tamsin considered lying, but it would only take naught but a few taps on her watch for Lynch to pull up Tamsin's schedule and catch her in the lie. It wasn't worth risking an even greater deduction for dishonesty. "Would you believe me if I said no?" "Nope." Tamsin sighed. "Fine. What's it gonna be?" Lynch regarded Tamsin thoughtfully for a moment before speaking. Nothing, so long as you don't tell anyone you saw me out here. Deal. Lynch nodded. Tamsin remained there for a second or two longer than necessary. She couldn't go to the music building now. Not with Lynch watching. You waiting for an engraved invitation? Tamsin shrugged. Bum a smoke? It seemed like a reason to justify her presence outside. It fit the whole persona she'd spent years crafting. Even though cigarettes were disgusting cancer sticks, and she wouldn't smoke one if paid. Lynch tossed back her head and laughed. With a hand holding the cigarette, she tapped at her own smartwatch with her ring finger. A second later, Tamsin's device buzzed against her skin in a sensation so familiar she felt it in her sleep. She didn't need to look down to see what had been done. Her rating, 1 point lower, 1 inch deeper into her own grave. You could have gotten away clean more, but you just can't help yourself, can you? Tamsin bit back all the responses that would result in the same thing. Even more points shaved off her rating. Guess not, Miss Lynch, but thankfully I've got you to keep me on the straight and narrow. She didn't wait for Lynch to respond. The door was still unlocked, and so she went through it, back into the belly of a beast that was liable to chew her up and spit her out before the year was through. Malapathrope would have its pound of flesh from Tamsin one way or another, and it felt like there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she could do about it. Hana Sakamoto, reading 76. Speed had always been Hannah's greatest strength as a skater. Today she'd pulled her hair back from her face into a ponytail, as she always did before practice. She was skating so fast across the nearly empty skating rink that the end of her ponytail lashed against her cheeks like a whip. Her coach, an inspirious Russian veteran of the sport and former Olympic champion, watched her fly by from the boards. Maxim Dmitriev was ancient, but his advanced age did nothing to reduce his demand as a coach. A scowl marred the lines of his weathered skin, but since Hannah had never seen him without it, she was probably sure that his face just looked that way even when he was happy. He wasn't happy now. She'd removed her smartwatch for practice. She never wore it while she was skating, but was sure that if it had been strapped to her wrist, she would have felt it buzz with Dimitri's displeasure. He wasn't afraid to dock her rating if he felt she wasn't trying hard enough. Hannah's rating depended not just the judges she faced in the competition. Her own coach's approval was paramount, and Dmitriev was unforgiving, which was precisely why Hannah's parents paid him an absurd amount of money to turn her into a champion. She shot by him and his scowling face, her blades scratching against the ice as she set up the jump that had eluded her all afternoon. The triple axel, the crown jewel of ladies figure skating, an element so difficult that only a handful of women had ever successfully completed it in an international competition. A few girls around Hannah's age had tried their hands at quadruple jumps, a mainstay of men's skating, but none had managed to work up enough consistency to incorporate them into their programs. The elusive triple axel was fiendishly difficult, but Hannah knew she could land it. Deep in her heart, she knew. Unfortunately, her body wasn't sure. The jump had a longer lead-in than the others in her short program. She needed to build up enough speed to launch herself from a forward outside edge. It was the only jump with a forward takeoff, the spin 3.5 times before landing in a backwards glide. And skating's code of points, falling on a fully rotated triple axel was still worth more than cleaning landing a double. It was a risk, but one worth taking. Hannah squatted her shoulders, bent her knee, and skidded the blade of her working leg into the ice, pushing it into the air. The world buzzed by in a blur as she pulled her arms into her chest to speed her rotations. 1.5 turns, 2, 3. Pain shut off Hannah's hips as she slammed into the ice again. That's enough. Dimitri's thick accent was as icy as the Siberian lakes on which he learned to skate. He hailed from the city of Novosibirsk, and at any time Hannah grumbled about the cold, he was quick to remind her that she was soft and spoiled. Had she grown up in a place like that, she'd be as hard and cold as he was. Hannah pushed herself up, brushing the snow off her leggings. She shuddered to think what her legs must look like under the stretchy black fabric, a symphony of black and blue, that disgusting mustard yellow. I can do it, Hannah said, though her voice quavered in a way she knew Dimitri wouldn't miss. She'd started at the season, but sure that a clean landing was just within her reach. But with every fail, her certainly crumbled, bit by bit. What had felt strong and light as air had grown heavier and heavier as the hours wore on. Her limbs weighed down in every jump and spin. Not today. Dmitri beckoned her to the boards like an obedient soldier. She followed. She skidded to a stop in front of him, the pain settling deep in her sore muscles and bruised bones. You are too slow, like a sluggish, Hannah thought. It was one of her least favorite words. Climbing up the ranks every time her coach sung it at her like a sharp rock. He'd been saying it more and more lately. The worst part was Hannah knew why. She ingested 600 calories all day, each one meticulously tracked on the little back notebook tucked into the side pocket of her backpack. Not even for a person leading a sedentary lifestyle, and most absurdly not enough for an elite athlete of Hannah's caliber. But the thinner she was, the faster she would spin, and the higher she would fly. It was a double-edged sword, and every day she buried that blade deeper and deeper into her bruised and battered body. Dimitri frowned deepened as he looked down at her. He wasn't very tall. Few male single skaters were, but Hannah was petite, even for a skater. Your condition is no good. We will have to build up stamina and strength. Hannah nodded, trying to mask how winded she truly was. She doubted that Dimitri would be fooled, but she had to try anyways. If he didn't think she was mentally strong enough to compete at the highest level of her sport, she knew he would not hesitate to move on to a new pupil, abandoning her without her coach. I think I'm coming down with something, She stifled for good measure. Her nose was usually runny at the rink anyway, so she had that working in her favor. I've been feeling off all day. An understatement, to be sure. Dmitri hummed thoughtfully. From the depths of his coat he produced a small beat-up wire-ruled notebook and a pen. He scribbled a few lines on a piece of paper and ripped it from the notebook. "We will end here today. Now you will go to this shop. Ask for these herbs. They are the best for what ails you." Hannah looked at the list. His handwriting was, as always, utterly illegible. Illegible. He could just make out the names and address of the shop, but the identities of whatever herbs he'd written down were beyond her. That he hadn't specified what it was he thought ailed her wasn't lost on her. "Okay," she said, slipping the scrap of paper into the pocket of her snugly fitted fleece. Normally she warmed up enough to keep herself upright. The hollow pit in her stomach widened like a chasm torn by a laser. She'd been light-headed all day practice, and now the strange and potent sense of what surely had to be some kind of witch's brew was not helping. She opened her eyes to see a black cat, heavily pregnant, sauntering across her path. It gazed at her with deeply unimpressed amber eyes. "Don't mind Sparkles," came a voice from the back of the shop. "She is in a mood." That voice sounded vaguely familiar, but the speaker was kneeling as she unpacked a box of candles to stack a lower shelf. The girl stood and looked around. She was wearing a bulky black cardigan, the sleeves of which swallowed her hand, and an burgundy top that matched the purple gloss on her lips. Her hair was mostly dark blonde, with a hint of lavender coloring with the ends. Hannah recognized her immediately, the Witch of Malapathrope. The girl's actual name, it would probably be impolite to refer to her as a witch, eluded Hannah. Thankfully, the girl didn't seem much interested in exchanging pleasantries. "How can I help you with something?" Her tone implied that she would rather not, but it wasn't beleaguered enough to put Hannah off her task. When her coach told her to do something, she did it. "Yes, actually," she groped in her pocket for Dimitri's hastily scribbled note. "I'm looking for some herbs." She handed the Witch of Malapathrope the note. "Looks like somebody slept through penmanship class," the girl said as she squinted at Dimitri's illegible scrawl. "I don't know if they have those in the Bronze Age." The Witch of Malapathrope cracked an actual smile. It was softened her face significantly. "I think I can just about make these out." The girl squinted at the paper as if urging it to relinquish its secrets. "Might have to go to the back to find some of these, though. Herbal remedies that taste, but aren't exactly flying off the shelf." Hannah nodded and immediately wished she hadn't. The room swayed on its axis, or maybe she was swaying. She reached out to place a steadying hand on the countertop. The sensation reminded her of the head rush she got when she came out of a scratch spin. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing her equilibrium to find itself. Hey! Hannah blinks her eyes open. The Witch of Malapathrope was looking at her expectantly, as if she'd been speaking to Hannah for some time, but her eyes couldn't have been closed for more than a second. Probably? Possibly? Hannah wasn't sure. You okay? Hannah nodded again, but because apparently she was a fool, her grip on the counter tightened, the skin across her knuckles turning white then pink. I'm fine. The girl held up Dimitri's note aloft. I'm gonna find the rest of these. The rest? Hannah looked down at the countertop to find two little baggies full of dried herbs sitting on top of it. Those hadn't been there before. Time had gone weird and elastic, and Hannah didn't like it one bit. The beaded curtain that separated the front of the shop from the black-tinted tinkled like chimes as the girl went through it. Hannah watched the long strands sway in her wake. The world tilted in the way it did when she was off her axis in a jump. Sometimes even the jumps with wonky takeoffs could be saved with a hand down or a two-footed landing or sheer determination. But some couldn't, no matter how hard she tried. Those were the times she knew she was going to fall, and fall she did. The curtain swayed again as the girl emerged, just in time to watch Hannah sink to the ground, her fingers sliding down the glass display case as she went. Holy crap. Wake up, wake up, wake up! Hannah woke up and immediately wished she hadn't. The light was shining in her eyes and she tried to bat it away before realizing it was a lamp on the table beside her. Hannah squinted at it from her position on the couch. Wait a minute. How did she get on a couch? The last thing she remembered was gawking at the Witch of Malapathrope. Oh, thank goodness. Hannah blinked at the voice. As her eyes adjusted to the light, the girl dissolved from a blur into a person. She was kneeling next to the sagging, well-worn couch. She stared down at Hannah, her heavily lined eyes wide and worried. I thought you were dead. It was a minor struggle reaching for words, but Hannah found them the same. That seems dramatic. You were down like the marionette that just had its strings cut. That was dramatic. She reached for something on the glass and held it out to Hannah. It was a glass of water. The sight made her realize just how parched her throat was. She accepted it with as much grace as her shaking hands could muster, not very much, and sipped. Her stomach roiled in revolt, displeased at being so assaulted after a day of deprivation. Are you okay? Hannah sipped her water again so she wouldn't have to answer. They didn't have the time to discuss all the ways she wasn't okay. The girl sighed. Okay, fine. Do you have a name? Everyone has a name. Hannah mumbled into her glass, realizing how rude it sounded, and added, Hannah. The other girl nodded. I'm Talisman Moore. Is there someone you want me to call? Tamsin. That was an odd name. It suited her. This Witch of Malapathrope. Maybe more so than her reputation. Tamsin didn't seem nearly as manthropic as Hannah had been led to believe. Hannah shook her head too fast and surge of nausea threatened to erupt, even though she knew there was nothing in her stomach to expel. No, Hannah said in a rush. It's okay. It was just a dizzy spell, not a big deal. Tamsin's eyebrows inched upwards. Really? Because you were pretty much out cold. Pretty much isn't entirely. There was a vague attempt at shuffling your feet as I carried you to the couch, but okay, have it your way. Thanks, Hannah said quietly. She looked at her surroundings. They were in an office, by the looks of it. A large desk sat under the oppressive weight of several sloppy stacks of papers. The faint scent of incense hung in the air. There was a small altar in the corner covered in with a dozen partly melted candles. A statue of wide-hipped female figure, and what looked like an honest-to-God crystal ball. Are you really a witch? Hannah asked. Tamsin blinked at her for a moment before a laugh bubbled from her lips. No, but my mom is. Hannah didn't know what to do with that information, so she just stored it away to mull over it later. I'm sorry for passing out in your shop. It seemed like the right thing to say. Don't sweat it. It was the most exciting thing to happen here all day. Oh, before I forget, Tamsin held up a little black notebook, its corners soft and round from use. This fell out of your backpack. Hannah's hand shot out and snatched the notebook from Tamsin's grasp. Nausea rolled in her gut. Her body wasn't ready to move quite so abruptly just yet, but the thought of someone flipping through her deepest, darkest secrets made Hannah want to hurl and then die. Whoa there! Tamsin held out her hands like a placeable, placing, placating gesture, just as if she expected Hannah to lash out like a wounded beast. In fairness, that was exactly what Hannah had done. I didn't read your dirty diary, weirdo. I wasn't raised by a pack of socially inept wolves. Hannah cycled through the number of possible responses. The book clutched tightly to her chest. She settled on the most basic. I'm sorry, I write dumb, embarrassing things in here sometimes. No worries. Girl's gotta have her secrets. I respect that, Tamsin said. Besides, not like I'd let you read my Grimoire. Is that like a spell book? Yeah. Do you really have one? No. Oh. A smirk ticked at the corner of Tamsin's lips. You sound disappointed. I'm not, Hannah said, even though she kind of was. Does the infamous witch of Malapathorpe fail to live up to your expectations? Hannah shrugged. It felt nice, this casual banter. She couldn't remember the last time she'd shared anything of the sort with someone her own age. Tamsin sat back on her heels, casting an appraising eye over Hannah. You sure you're okay? A door slammed in the front of the shop, saving Hannah from having to answer. Tamsin, sunshine, I'm home. Sunshine? Hannah asked. Tamsin didn't seem like a sunshine. Ugh, gross. Tamsin pushed herself to stand, brushing her hands off the thighs of her artificially torn black jeans. I'm in the office, Mom. All the shouting was making Hannah's skull pulsate as if it was trying to liquefy her brain. An older woman entered the room, and Hannah did a double take as if one were to scrape off the layers of dark eye makeup around Tamsin's blue eyes. She and her mother would be nearly identical. Mrs. Moore had aged astonishingly well. She didn't look old enough to have borne a child Tamsin's age, and there was a way to how she carried herself that seemed utterly foreign to Hannah. Her limbs were loose and her steps were assured. In contrast, Hannah's mother had a gait that was clipped and precise as anything else about her. Tamsin's looked like she would be equally at home fronting for a gently alternative rock band or telling fortunes in a tent like a Renaissance festival. Hannah loved her at once. Upon seeing the strange girl half lying on a couch, Mrs. Moore dropped her bags she was carrying and rushed to Hannah's side. She must have looked even worse than she felt. "Oh, honey, what happened to you?" She looked at Tamsin as she said it, as if some mystical maternal intuition told her Hannah's word on the situation was not to be trusted. She just sort of fainted," Tamsin said. "This is Hannah, by the way." "Hello, Hannah." Hannah smiled at Mrs. Moore's hand settled on her forehead to check her temperature. Hannah couldn't remember the last time she'd been touched like that. Illness were like injuries, obstacles on the path to perfection, hurdles to be leaped without a second of glance. "It's okay," Hannah said. "I just got a little dizzy. I worked out hard at skating practice today." Mrs. Moore popped up to stand. "Ah, did you eat before the skating practice?" Hannah blinked, perplexed at both the woman's casual acceptance of teenage girls fitting in her shop and her quick leap to the solution. She was stunned enough to admit it. No. "Well, that's something we can fix. I picked up some incredible cheese at the public market. I was thinking of using it to make some pasta." She was already bustling back to her bags, ordering Tamsin to carry the rest to the kitchen. "Hannah, you're staying for dinner. Not negotiable. Negotiable. The public market was one of the main grocery stores in Jackson Hills. But not the nice one Hannah's parents shopped at. It was open to anyone, regardless of their rating. The supermarket Hannah's mother preferred required scanning in with a minimum rating of 80. But that wasn't what made Hannah swallow the rising tide of her nausea as she swung her legs off the side of the couch and forced herself to stand. Her equilibrium hadn't fully recovered, but years of spinning on a steel blade only 4 millimeters wide had made her excellent at faking balance when she had none. "No, it's really okay, Mrs. Moore," Hannah said, biting the inside of her cheek to distract from her clamoring stomach. Hannah's mother looked at Hannah over an armful of brown bags bristling with groceries. "It's Mrs. Moore. It's Mrs. Moore. No Mr. in this picture. It's Miss Moore. There's no Mr. in this picture. And are you sure?" "There is no trouble at all. You really should eat something, sweetheart." This woman didn't even know her, and she was calling her sweetheart. Hannah blinked and backed the sudden moisture in her eyes. "I'm okay." She scooped up her backpack and her skate bag, settling them on the opposite shoulders. She couldn't bear it, the thought of these kind, generous people watching her pretend to eat. Hannah had the feeling that it would be harder to trick Tamsin's mother than her own. "Thank you," she said to them both. Thanks." She ducked behind the beaded curtain before either could respond. Over her shoulder, Hannah caught a glimpse of Tamsin's expression as she made her escape. Tamsin's brow was pinched, and her mouth was a stern line. Mrs. Moore just looked confused. Hannah pushed herself home despite the lingering weakness of her muscles and the persistent pounding of her head. The journey went by in a blur. Neither of her parents was home. That made things easier. Though the sense memory of Mrs. Moore's soft hand on her forehead made something inside her clench that wasn't hunger. It was until Hannah had changed into a nice warm pair of sweats and sat down to record her afternoon practice in her little black notebook that she noticed the notebook stuck between the pages. The note stuck between the pages, sealed, was with the face of a smiling jester. Okay.